What's poppin', mi gente? Your boy's back. Back with another video. Now, this last month has been crazy productive and busy as far as the project goes. I was initially just going to do a couple of status effects for the initial alpha release. However, I decided to get them all done because, to be frank, coming back later and having to look at my code and make sure I didn't break anything would have taken, or would have rather made it take a lot longer than if I just got it done now. So that's what I did. And when I say status effects, I'm referring to the ones that can be inflicted on enemies. The player status effects have not changed. The player can only be inflicted with poison, curse, freeze, or petrify. And those are the only status effects I intend to ever implement because, again, the goal behind this game is to make you feel powerful, not like you're crippled half of the time from a ridiculous menagerie of things hitting you, which just never works out good and I feel detracts from the overall play experience. So, this video is going to actually show each and every one of the status effects that can now be inflicted upon enemies. However, before I go into that, I did want to give a quick shout out to some of my top Patreon supporters. As always, I appreciate all the support, and I definitely like to give props to those who go above and beyond in supporting the project. So this is going to list everybody who has donated well over $100 to the project within their lifetime. Let me start by thanking my top two supporters, which are Hosani69 and XBirchX. I mean, you guys have been exemplary and have definitely gone above and beyond. There's a huge gap between these two guys and everybody else, so again, I appreciate all the support. You guys are really helping to make this happen. Underneath that, we have Chuck, Glitch Slime, Kobe A, Quince, Tony Smoot, Andy A, Arturo De La Torre, my boy L Brian 42, good to see you still here, Justin H, Jordan, Caesar E, Chase F, Zane G, Daniel C, Tommy L, Nathan T, Matt O, Nicholas G, Andreas A, Crimson Curse, Ed, Hal Patrick H, Jaden K, Gwendolyn H, Kilumari, Porks Riches, sorry if I mispronounced that, Varian X, Mead, Not Jeff, Griffin G, Triforce Chris, Aiden T, excuse me, Stefan, Andy B, Maxim S, Philly Red Sox, Francisco, Mark W, Elijah, Norman F, and that's that. Again, I want to give a quick shout out to all these guys for the support. You know, you guys have been amazing. These are all current members. They're doing everything they can to support the project, so I appreciate it. As well as I appreciate the rest of my lower tier Patreon supporters. You know, if you guys want to get a quick shout out, go ahead and cross that $100 tier, and as soon as you do, I'll be happy to shout you out. You know, once you do pass, if you want that shout out, it's important to you, again, feel free to reach out to me. I also want to point out that I recently had a Patreon supporter that actually went above and beyond, and that he actually offered me a generous donation of $100 for just 30 minutes to speak to me, and that's Sean M. You know, I appreciate it. You know, if anybody else wants to reach out and make the same offer, you're free to, and we can always have a quick chat on Discord for maybe 30 minutes or so. But I, again, didn't want to market that out there because I don't want people to feel like, you know, now I'm trying to hustle them for money for my time. You know, again, I always say the same thing. Nobody owes me anything. Nobody has to give me anything. But again, I appreciate it. It is making the project a reality. It does make all the difference. So I feel like these guys should definitely get some props for the extra funding they're doing and the fact that they are going above and beyond here. As they say, money talks, and I really appreciate you guys going above and beyond with this. Okay, so now with all the wonderful shout outs out of the way, let's dive right in because there's quite a few of these status effects that you can utilize against your enemies. And this is set up in a way so that you can take different combinations of weapons with a modern character like Alucard and build around that. With a character like Legacy Richter, it's not as apparent because he doesn't have such a moveset, and any Legacy characters are designed to be more basic. But with somebody like Alucard, there's so many more options, or a Symphony of the Night Richter. Well, you'd see what I'm talking about once the game comes out and is further along in development. A quick disclaimer as well, because you will notice there is an HUD here. This is a placeholder HUD. An artist attempted to redo it, but unfortunately the results were just not very good, so I have another artist that's going to redo them correctly. You'll also notice icons under the enemy for status effects. Some of these are final, Others will be getting touched up, so if you see an inconsistency in the graphical quality, I'm well aware of it. Don't worry about it. Alright, so diving right in, burn status, and holy/intense burn. Now these two burn statuses go together, and you can have up to 6 stacks of them combined, meaning if you, for example, had 2 burn stacks, you could have up to 4 holy burn stacks. And what happens is when these are inflicted, it'll look and see, is the new burn stack being inflicted altogether stronger than the old one? If so, overwrite it. This is basically a way to add a dot damage over time effect to the enemies, and is as simple as it gets, as I'm going to demonstrate now. As you can see, he's taking periodic damage. Nothing else to really say there. And there are even some crashes that are designed behind that. And something like Hydrostorm does its primary damage via the dot. If the damage seems a little low right now, don't worry, this will be tweaked later. So that's burn status in a nutshell. Nice and simple, as I said. This is as basic as we can get when it comes to the different status effects. Also, one more disclaimer I want to throw in. You're going to see me showing off a lot of these status effects. For example, bleed here is going to be shown off with a dagger, but in-game it won't have a bleed effect, and you'll see a lot of times I'm just going to attribute the status effect to the vampire killer's attack just for simplicity of the video. I just wanted to make that clear. This way people weren't thinking when they actually played the game your basic attack was going to do all this crazy stuff. It won't. This is again just for demonstrational purposes. On that note, bleed status. At first, seems a lot like burn status in that it's just a DOT, damage over time. Except in this case, you'll notice it's slower, does a lot less, and overall seems weak. However, if you manage to get 6 stacks of it, the enemy takes a chunk of damage. And this was inspired by Dark Souls as well as Dead Cells, because I didn't want it to be exactly the same as burn, and that burn is fire and forget. You can just hit the enemy with it, leave them alone, and their health ticks down. With bleed, you're going to want to be more proactive. Your goal is to keep that burst damage coming, which can add up very quickly and help to tear your enemy into kibbles and bits. Next up is going to be one of my personal favorite status effects, poison. Now, poison at first seems almost like a cross between burn and bleed, in that, yes, you can hit the enemy once or twice to inflict it, but look how slow that damage is. It's not hitting him often. And much like bleed, there is a benefit to staying on the enemy. So it encourages a much more aggressive playstyle. You'll notice the poison level at the bottom is building up, and he's taking damage faster and faster. And now you'll see he's taking hits repeatedly. And that can really add up very, very quickly. Because I've inflicted quite a number of stacks of it on him, and now you can just walk away once you've inflicted it and let his health tick down. And as you can see, you have to hit a couple of times to refresh it. This was actually inspired by Salt and Sanctuary, in that the poison status effect in that game functions very similar. And I like this idea because it was more of a high risk, higher reward type of scenario, in that if you're dealing with a very fast, dangerous enemy, which, let's be real, if you're going to use this kind of status effect, it's probably going to work better on medium, large size enemies versus smaller things like skeletons. Obviously, it's going to be useless against things like bats and Medusa heads. But for something like that, a boss, a mid-boss, something that's more of a threat, if you're willing to focus your attacks long enough, you can really, really build up that poison, and then kind of back up and focus on dodging their attacks, striking while you can while their health ticks away. Next up is another status effect that I really enjoy, and that's curse status. I was initially going to make it so curse status randomly made the enemy's attacks fail, just like it affects the player, but I decided against that for a good number of reasons I won't explain here. Curse status, what it does is it enhances the effectiveness of other status effects. So if they're affected by burn, bleed, poison, they're going to take more damage. If they're affected by something like freeze, it might take 1 or 2 more hits to break them out of it. Petrify, it'll take 1 less hit to shatter them, etc. So curse status by itself would be mediocre, but works as an enhancer to other status effects. And you can see the counter at the bottom has to be built up for it to even affect them. And then once it's built up, you can just maintain it by periodically hitting them. making this extremely useful if combined with other status effects properly. Next up is freeze status, which freeze status is designed to be set up so that it basically incapacitates the enemy for about 5 seconds, and then when they break free, they're inflicted with slow for a short time as well. Making it very good against medium-sized enemies, as well as large groups of enemies where you find yourself surrounded. If an enemy is very weak to it, it'll take more than one hit to actually break them out of freeze. But I will say this, that depending on how you set this up, this could be extremely powerful. I am, however, in particular, extremely proud of the graphical effects I managed to get with it, because Unity's particle system is extremely powerful, and I'm going to show you guys what I mean right now. You can see this guy is very weak to it because it's taken more than one hit to bust him out of it. But if you pay attention, when I break him out, I will tell you up front, initially when he's frozen like this, that's a different color palette. But when he's shattered out, when you see all these particles go everywhere, they are exactly that. Him shattering are particles. And this effect, I may make a tutorial on how to duplicate it in the future, because I feel like there are people out there that might really enjoy doing this, because it really does help to simplify things. And the particle system in Unity is very wondrous. But I'm digressing a bit here. I'm kind of gushing over the graphics. Again, freeze can be very, very useful at incapacitating enemies, and I'll say it now. All of these status effects are designed to be used against bosses and mid-bosses in addition to regular enemies. But there will be things in play to keep you from being able to inflict them over and over on bosses and mid-bosses, versus regular enemies who will be affected all the time. Bosses and mid-bosses will have controls in place so the game doesn't become what I call Easyvania. Because for those of you who have watched my videos, you know my main goal was to make the original game much harder and much more of a challenge on the same level as Castlevania 3. Next up is going to be a status effect that was without a doubt the most advanced and difficult to implement because of the graphical requirements, as well as ensuring it would be balanced, and that's Petrify. Petrify is set up so that if the enemy is weak to it, or excuse me, depending on the enemy's defense against it, determines how long they stayed petrified for. With an enemy being very weak, is never going to unpetrify, and they'll actually shatter and die. So it's basically an instant kill on them. With other enemies, it depends on the enemy's size. Once they're petrified, they take reduced damage, but if you hit them enough times, they'll shatter, dying instantly. Now, of course, depending on who the enemy is, some enemies like bosses, mid-bosses, etc., you can't shatter them. It's basically just free damage. But this move is very, very powerful if utilized properly. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate now because there's a lot of effects involved in it as well. You can see the Petrify is building up at the bottom, but he's not turned to stone yet. And now he is. Okay, so now let's see what happens if I start hitting him. And that's the story of him. He's dead as a fucking doornail, shattered into a million pieces. And now let's go ahead and see that exact scenario when an enemy is weak to Petrify, what happens. And I set up the Vampire Killer so that on the first hit, it'll inflict Petrify status just to save us some time. As you can see, the enemy was completely unhittable, but is dead as hell, shattered into a million pieces, no muss, no fuss, versus in the DS-Vanias where you would have had to still hit the enemies to kill them, which never made any sense to me. I mean, if the enemy is going to be petrified forever, why waste your time like that? And I also took the time to put in an extra little effect if the enemy is petrified in the air and very weak to it, meaning they're going to die anyway. So let's see what happens when I do that. As you can see, he hits the ground, shatters, done deal. Another little detail that I put in that is very minor, but something that always irked me in the original game, was the fact that you could petrify an enemy, run into them, and take touch damage still. That is not the case. If they're petrified, or frozen, or time stopped and their speed is set to 0, now to be clear, you cannot stand on top of them. As you saw, I stomped and bounced off him, but if I attempted to stand on him, I would fall right through him. but enemies in the game now will actually block your forward movement. For enemies like a skeleton size. Obviously for things like a Medusa head or a bat, that's not the case. You can still walk through them. But this helps to add a lot more depth to the game while removing some of the older archaic stuff that I just felt made no sense. Again, very minor things, but the big thing about the original Symphony of the Night was the devil was definitely in the details, and all the little details that the game developers chose to implement were what really, really helped that game to stand out and look like it was on another level versus the games that came later in the series and just seemed somewhat mediocre in comparison. Next up is going to be two status effects that kind of go hand in hand, slow and time stop. The two can be combined together to be more effective. So if you have an enemy that, for example, is resistant to slow to the point where you can't slow them down completely, you can also throw in some time stop to do that. Time stop affects everything on screen, slow will only affect the enemies hit by it, but this allows me to set up attacks like you're about to see now with the stopwatch that affects everything on the screen and can be stacked up over and over to use it to make it just overall more powerful and more effective. Versus time stop is something that's more like, it's going to give you a break here. It has its uses, and if you properly set your character up, you can use these moves more often in conjunction to make them more effective. Yeah, I know that's a very long explanation for a very basic feature, so let's get the hell into it here. And as you can see, he's stopped completely now. I still have Petrify on my weapon too, which I forgot about. You're also going to notice something interesting here. The Petrify completely removed the slow status. And that's the case. It removes most status effects, with the exception of, I believe at the moment, I have it set to time stop. Which, let's do that next. And you can see it's affecting him. He's petrified longer. A very minor thing, but there are reasons I set things up like this, because certain moves are being set, or certain status effects are being set to synchronize better than others. Otherwise, it'd be completely pointless. Some of the moves would feel like, well, this is just thrown in for the hell of it. There's a lot more idiosyncrasies that I'm not going into in this video because it would just be too long, but trust me on this. I've put some serious foresight into this stuff. And here's a perfect demonstration of stacking stuff together.
Time, be still!
Obviously, this doesn't seem very effective on a small enemy like a skeleton, but if you were to instead use this on something like a red slasher, or a hammer shaker, or a diplocephalus, or stone rose, well, the fact that the stopwatch might only be able to slow them down to maybe halfway would seem mediocre until time stop was thrown in. And on top of that, then you have all the other enemies in the screen disabled. The point is, if it's used properly, it's another combination of weapons that can be very, very powerful, while also being very basic and not needing a huge manual to explain the intricacies of them. This isn't Diablo 3, for God's sake. Next up is a status effect that I feel has a lot of damage potential, so much so that I already had to tone it down twice, and that's Shock. This was actually inspired by Dead Cells heavily, because I was really looking for an effect with lightning, because it seems messed up that fire and ice have one, but lightning does it just to leave it out. So, here you go. As you can see, it basically has a chain lightning kind of effect where the enemy inflicted with shock has a stack of shock inflicted on that hits 6 times. It does a portion of damage, and then a portion of that damage is cut down further to the 3 closest enemies. If there's no enemies nearby, well then that extra damage obviously isn't dealt out to anybody. But I will tell anybody up front who wants to reproduce this lightning kind of effect, look up something called line renderers. I actually wasn't aware of their existence until I started working with this. But shock could be very useful at crowd control for those people who maybe don't want to use slow and time stop and want something more basic. I don't know if you guys all noticed, but it has a significant amount of hit stun as well, which is very, very useful. Because if you're surrounded by enemies, you can use this as a way to cut down their numbers. As well, if you had something like bats or Medusa head spawning, you can hit an enemy with shock, and then watch as that enemy acts like a lightning rod and wipes out all of those little ankle biter enemies for you. Again, keep in mind the damage numbers here are not final, because I know I'm going to have some jackass that's going to come in the video description and go, Oh, well that looks like minor damage. It looks next to useless. Well, Goofy, I've now said 3 times in the video that the damage numbers are just placeholders. Please, for the love of God, pull your head out of your ass. It shoves so far deep in there that you can bring yourself to orgasm through prostate stimulation. There's also another thing I want to point out. When it comes to the status effects, the number on the icon will actually tell you a bit about how effective it is. Like you'll notice right now it's yellow. That means it's normal. The enemy has no resistance, no weakness to it. If instead the icon was red, it would mean the enemy is weak to that status effect, and blue means resistance. A similar thing was done with damage values, where there's one animation where an enemy takes normal damage from the attack based on the element of it, versus another animation when they're weak to it, and if they're strong to it, the numbers are in blue. If it heals the enemy, the number is green, and when they're petrified, the number is gray to indicate they're taking reduced damage, so that you have more information on screen without the screen getting cluttered. And as I'm about to show you now, when you have multiple status effects on an enemy, there's also room for it in the bar of the enemy.
Time, be still!
It kind of squeezes in there. So this is done so that, again, we're not cluttering up the screen with too much garbage, which detracts from the overall gameplay experience. And last but definitely not least is the Purify status effect. Now there isn't much to say about Purify here. It's designed to let you kill enemies that normally can't be permanently killed. Think of red skeletons. That's all I can say without saying too much. As you can see, it's inflicting something on this skeleton, but against him it's literally useless. This is just so you can see the effect. I can't really go into more details than that at this point because the red skeleton isn't implemented yet, but for those who are wondering what would happen, look at Dracula X Chronicles, or better yet, look at Portrait of Ruin, what happens when you hit a red skeleton with the undead killer. Alright, so that's all I've got to say now. Again, this video ended up being a lot longer than I wanted it to be, but I mean, this is what happens when you're passionate about something, people. Time flies. So, leave a comment down below on the video. If you're a Patreon supporter, as always, comment on Patreon, you'll get a lot more attention. Like the video. If you have any feedback, any ideas, you're welcome to throw them into the comments of the video, whatever's clever. As always, everybody's welcome to join the forums on the Facebook group. I know the question that's going to come up again is when is there going to be a release, and I have covered this several times recently. A release is looming, sometime in the next 2 or 3 months, but again, the initial release is going to be an alpha only, and it's only going to be released to Patreon supporters who have donated $100 and up and have been members for 3 months or more. That point is not debatable, so even if you were to pop in a day before I was going to release it and offer me $1,000, if you haven't been a Patreon supporter for 3 months, you're just not getting the release, and it's that simple. So join up right now, because again, I don't want to hear the complaining a month or 2 from now when it's looming and people are all butthurt and angry because they feel like they're entitled to something. The rules aren't going to change. After the initial alpha release, the rest of my Patreon supporters will of course get access to it maybe 2 or 3 weeks after that, and then a general release will probably come 2 or 3 weeks after that as well. Okay, so that's it. I will most likely put up a post updating my progress as well with this video on what is left before release, but right now I've got to go. I'm actually supposed to be heading out somewhere, and this was supposed to be a quick video, but I've been working on it for some time now. So again, I appreciate all the support. I hope you all like what you see, and I will talk to you all later. Peace.